A prominent Edmonton psychologist goes missing. His body isn't found. Police believe he was murdered and that his brother had something to do with it. They just have to get him to confess. I'm Dave Breckenridge, and this is 10-3. Regina Leader Post courts reporter Brandon Harder joins me to discuss how police ensnared a murder suspect in an elaborate undercover investigation, why one brother killed the other, and how it all unfolded. Don't forget, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Brandon, this week you published a pretty in-depth feature at leaderpost.com about a pretty chilling case that dates back all the way to the 1990s. Before we get into some of the details of the investigation that you revealed in your feature, I guess for starters, who was Patrick Thauberger?
Yeah, so Patrick Cyril Thauberger was a clinical psychologist, and he went missing in 1997. And at that time, he was 53 years old. He lived in Edmonton, but he was from Saskatchewan, where he still had a lot of family. And prior to his disappearance, he'd stopped to visit family in Regina. And following that, he was meant to be taking a bus home to Edmonton, but ultimately he never got on that bus. And considerable efforts were made to find him, but those initial efforts were unsuccessful. And then in 2014, after a lot of years of what I imagine was filled with pain and uncertainty, his family applied to the court to have him declared deceased. But it wasn't until late 2020 that his remains were discovered, and that was after his brother Joe was arrested and charged with murder. And the whole thing was really hard on the family. A number of them gave victim impact statements at Joe's trial. By their account, Patrick was an intelligent, accomplished guy with a sense of humor, and he really sought to help folks through his work.
So as you mentioned, his brother was eventually charged with his murder, but at the time he went missing, was his brother kind of on police radar, or did police have any theories about what might have happened to him and who else could have been responsible?
Yeah, as far as what police theories were initially, I don't know a lot about that, but what is clear is they became really interested in what Joe knew. And they talked to him more than a half dozen times over the years. He even at one point agreed to take a polygraph test, which, according to him, he failed. But until 2020, his story was always the same to police. He told them he dropped Patrick off at the bus depot.
So as you mentioned, over the years, they spoke with Joe a number of times, and eventually it led to charges. But I imagine that would have had to have been after some pretty thorough investigating. And as you uncover in your feature, in 2020, we meet up with Joe again, and he's been approached by someone claiming that he's looking to exact some street justice on someone who had also previously done Joe wrong. And this individual in your story is named Cliff. How does Joe get wrapped up with this guy, Cliff?
Yeah, so in November of 2020, Joe gets a knock on his door, and there's this guy standing there who, as you mentioned, introduces himself as Cliff. And Cliff's sort of apologetic at first, but he quickly establishes that he and Joe share a common enemy, and this is some guy who ripped off Cliff's niece for thousands of dollars, and apparently also ripped off Joe for around 30 grand or so, the story goes. I call that guy Frank in my story because his real name's under a publication ban.
Mm-hmm.
But Cliff seems to be pretty upset about the whole ordeal. He's really profane, sort of aggressive, saying he's going to find Frank and he's going to deal with him. Lessons will be learned, so on and so forth. But he wants Joe's help to track Frank down, eh? So, Joe's more than willing to pitch in with that.
So this guy Cliff shows up at Joe's door and says that they have a common enemy, as you say. But what was it about Cliff that Joe didn't know at the time?
Well, primarily that he's an undercover cop. Cliff almost assuredly isn't his real name. I have no idea what his real name is because even in court, he was sworn in as Cliff. But I guess Joe also doesn't know that Cliff has no interest in tracking down Frank. He's interested in what Joe knows about Patrick's disappearance. And the whole plot gets pretty wild as the operation unfolds.
Yeah, you go into some pretty kind of crazy places. And I'm curious, like, spell out for us, how extensive was this ruse? I mean, I've heard of Mr. Big investigations where maybe they kind of get someone wrapped up in a criminal conspiracy and then get suspects to admit other wrongdoings. I've even just heard of undercover officers posing as convicts in jail cells next to suspects and trying to get them to talk. How extensive was the ruse in this case in trying to ensnare Joe? What kind of things did Cliff do to make Joe think he was for real?
Well, the police operation only ran for just over a week, but the whole thing was really elaborate. It involved a bunch of undercover cops playing various roles, and Joe's exposed to a bunch of stuff that makes him think Cliff really means business. Like, for instance, early on, Cliff smashes up a car that's meant to be Frank's. He breaks windows and taillights and does a lot of yelling, and it's meant to send a message to Frank, but really what it does is send a message to Joe. Then they go to a fake brothel where Cliff is supposedly running women. Cliff shows Joe that he's taking out a fake and definitely criminal life insurance policy on Frank to try and get their money back. Then there's this whole piece where a bunch of thugs from Fort McMurray have supposedly kidnapped Frank and are holding him hostage in a motel room, waiting for Cliff to decide what to do about it. They even go so far as to have a guy sitting in the motel room on a chair with his head covered. And at one point, 30 grand was counted out in front of Joe with the understanding that it could be coming his way depending on how things go. So all of it was designed to put Joe in a situation where he felt comfortable enough with Cliff that he'd share what he knew about Patrick's disappearance.
We'll be right back. As people may know, a lot of times they hear about these quote unquote Mr. Big investigations where there's a suspect who's being dealt with by an undercover officer and they're trying to convince the suspect that they're dealing with a bona fide criminal to get them to admit their own misdeeds. How long did it take Joe to warm up to Cliff? And what was it that finally got him to start talking about Patrick?
Yeah, when it came to dealing with Frank, Joe was pretty warm from the word go, honestly. But when it came to talking about what he knew about his brother's disappearance, he was a bit more shy. He was willing to talk about how Patrick's disappearance related to what he knew about insurance, but when it came to questions about whether he'd had a hand in the disappearance, he was pretty standoffish. So throughout the whole operation, Cliff sort of plays like he needs to be sure he can trust Joe. And the idea is this: if they're in it together and something is going to be done about Frank, then they're going to have to share their secrets with one another, a sort of criminal bond, if you will. And Joe dances around a confession for a really long time. The exchange is tense, but in the end, he ends up telling Cliff that he killed Patrick.
What did he say happened to Patrick? Like, why did he do it, and how did he kill him?
He said he and Patrick owned some farmland together, and that they argued over the sale of some of it. And ultimately, when negotiations didn't go the way he wanted them to, Joe hit Patrick over the head with a hammer and then choked him out with a rope.
And ultimately, I mean, aside from telling Cliff about it, did he take Cliff to the scene to kind of prove what he did?
Well, the scene was actually at Joe's house where Cliff first met him, but they never actually went inside the house during the operation. After he confessed to killing Patrick, though, Joe eventually took Cliff out to the farmland where Patrick's body was buried. It was buried in a slough under a pile of rocks. And basically, by that time, it was game over for Joe. And it really wasn't long before lots of cops were in his house taking all kinds of pictures and collecting evidence and whatnot.
Now, the bulk of this was based on recordings that were produced by police and a part of the undercover investigation. And these were presented in a hearing back in March of 2023. What was it like hearing some of these conversations?
Yeah, um, it's kind of a tired saying, but I guess it was like being on a fly on the wall, right? I had already covered the trial, so I obviously knew how it ended, and yeah, it's a miserable case, like much of what I cover. But getting an inside look at how these cops managed to get that confession was really fascinating. It's not something I have an opportunity to do very often. And this whole thing honestly seemed like it could have come off the rails at any point. But the cops involved are clearly skilled people, and especially Cliff. His ability to react as things sort of evolved is quite amazing.
Hmm. When the case ultimately came to court, what did Joe have to say for himself and about the police investigation?
Yeah, so Joe told the court a different story again. It was that Patrick's death was an accident and that he covered it up because he was afraid of being wrongfully convicted. He said he didn't want to become the next David Milgaard. He mentioned Milgaard many times, and he explained what he told Cliff by saying that it was actually manufactured. He testified that he felt he needed to say he'd done something bad in order to get the money that was potentially on offer from Cliff. But evidently, the judge didn't believe that. She decided that the only explanation that made sense was the one that Joe offered Cliff about hitting Patrick with the hammer and then strangling him before disposing of the body. And when he was convicted of murder in July of 2023, Joe actually said he was surprised. He said then that he felt like Milgaard, and he actually said that if he had the chance to do it over again, he'd do the same thing in covering it up.
Hmm.
The judge didn't look too fondly on that sentiment, and the family likely didn't either.
Yeah. So he was convicted of murdering his brother. What was his sentence?
Yeah, he was given a life sentence with no chance of parole for 10 years. But he only served about 4.5 months because he actually died in December of 2023.
Hmm. Well, I have to say it's a fascinating read, a fascinating look into how police conduct these investigations. For listeners who are interested in checking out more on this case, they can check out the feature at leaderpost.com. Brandon, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Brandon Harder. You can read the whole feature on this case at leaderpost.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.